Chapter 2. Rain pattered against a small window above Sean's shoulder. The custody van had waited in the secluded yard outside the court with its doors open, so the air was damp with an October chill that soaked into his bones. They'd climbed in, one by one, under the cold, watchful eyes of a couple of machine-gun-toting cops, whose fingers danced on the trigger guards. They were clearly taking their job seriously. The inside was like a normal minibus, except that it smelled of sweat and damp clothes, and each seat was enclosed by a small mesh cage. Sean had sat where he was told, and the cage door had been locked behind him. After 3 schools and 2 foster families, he'd actually wanted to stay with the families, but they couldn't get rid of him fast enough. He'd finally found somewhere determined to keep him, when all he wanted to do was leg it. A week earlier, he'd turned 16. He'd had better presents. "What is this?" The angry, whining tones came from the guy seated behind Sean. "No seatbelt? We could get killed!" Oh, God. Sean closed his eyes. The prick had the kind of voice that was carefully tuned to pierce your eardrums. Someone shut him up. His head was still throbbing from last night's farewell party. Matt had rounded up all the Lytton guys, not just Curly, but Joe and Wayne and Spence and all of them, to mark Sean's last opportunity to get well and truly wasted for a good long time. They all knew and appreciated that Matt and Curly were free because Sean wasn't. But that was how it rolled. You took your hits. It sucked that of the 3 people Sean loved most in the world, Matt and Gaz and Copper, his surrogate big brothers, Matt was the only one still at liberty to throw the party. But maybe it was also appropriate. Most of Sean's first life experiences, first drink, first smoke, first binger, had taken place in Matt's flat. A party for Sean's first custodial sentence kind of completed the deal. He rested his head against the plastic around the window and tried to wish his headache away. His ears popped and another stab of pain entered his brain as the guard slammed the rear door closed. The driver turned round and addressed his passengers. "Hold on tight, ladies. Next stop, Burnley Palace." Sean rolled his eyes. He wished. Burnley Young Offender Institution might be an HM prison, but it was hardly fit for royalty. The van began to move, slowly trundling through the narrow tunnel, waiting while the metal gate rolled back to let it out into the world again. Then it was on the road and past the sculpted concrete blocks that acted as car bomb protection. It lurched as the driver shifted up, which simultaneously set off Sean's headache and his whiny neighbour again. "Oi! You know we don't have any cushions!" Sean closed his eyes. By the end of the journey, he suspected turning round and planting his fist in McWhiney's face would feel like a really good idea, apart from the mesh between them. Peter, his caseworker, had explained it. No cushions because offenders ripped them off. No seat belts in case the prisoners hanged themselves. Sean had to grin at the image he had of a butcher's truck, corpses dangling from the ceiling when they opened the doors. The cops had wanted him on remand. They didn't know about the attempted garage heist, but they did have him for the bike. It was taking without consent, not theft, because they couldn't prove he hadn't meant to return it, but they had fingerprints. They couldn't show that Sean had ever nicked a vehicle before, but they had him in several vehicles that had also been twocked. But on the plus side, he'd never been more than a few miles from Walthamstow in his life, and had no previous record for assault. His solicitor had successfully argued that he was not a flight risk. The public were in no peril from him, and the remand cells were already too full of far more dangerous cases, so bail. He had duly turned up for sentencing, hungover, in a borrowed jacket and tie, with a pair of armed cops lurking at the back of the stand. Must have taken all of 30 seconds. The judge had said he was taking Sean's guilty plea into consideration, and this was a first offence, but it had involved violence, in that he had assaulted the Ninja's owner, and yada yada yada. 12 months, 6 in custody, 6 on parole, in the community. "A year," his mum had sobbed. She and PJ, the latest boyfriend, had come to visit him in the holding cell with a change of clothes. His usual things, so that he didn't have to wear the borrowed clothes in jail. Bit switched on for Mum, so probably PJ's idea. "But it's okay, sweetheart. I'll come and see you whenever I can." Then she'd broken down in tears, like She always did. Whatever life did to her, she cried. At least PJ seemed like someone Sean was prepared to leave her with, unsupervised. She'd gone through a bad run of boyfriends who liked to hit her, which had finally ended when Sean grew big enough to start hitting them back. PJ seemed fond of her, and that was all he asked. So Sean had given her a hug and a peck on the cheek, because she was a fat, soppy old cow, but hey, she was his mum. Chances of her getting round to visiting were, he knew, somewhere between 0 and zilch. Heavy drops were a metallic drumbeat on the roof as they rolled round the M25. The weather matched Sean's mood. He'd been nicked during the summer, and it was now an early evening in autumn. Summer had come and gone, and what a great one it had been. 3 months under curfew at home on the Lytton Mills estate, with a tag on his ankle. At least it meant he had been elsewhere the night of the riots, and when the White Hart Lane bomb went off. That summer there had been a distinct sense of the world going to shit, even more than usual. And it hadn't all been because of his looming court date. With terrorist strikes getting closer to home, everyone wondering where the next one would fall, Sean was happy to be stuck on the estate. Matt had joked that IS had a good sense of PR, so they wouldn't blow up Lytton Mills in case anyone mistook it for doing the world a favour. Eventually the van jarred to a halt. Its way was blocked by more bomb barriers and a massive solid gate set in a towering red brick wall. The driver had a brief conversation with the guys outside. Then there was the sound of moving machinery and the gate slowly slid aside. The van edged forward into a tunnel, and the journey was over. Name? Sean Harker. S-E-A-N? Sean briefly considered responding with no, D-I-P-S-T-I-C-K, but the glint in the eye of the large woman on the other side of the counter made him rethink. Her uniform blouse was stretched tight over the muscles beneath it. "Mm-hmm," he said out loud. "Date of birth?" Reception into Burnley was about as welcoming as Sean had expected it to be. This was a prison that meant punishment, not group hugs and a welcome party. The woman bashed at her keyboard like she was personally insulted that of all the prisons in the world, Sean Harker had to turn up in hers. The windowless reception room smelled of sweat and fish and chips. The intake from the van sat in a row of chairs down one wall. Half-assed efforts had been made to decorate the place. There was a fish tank against the far wall with grimy sides and 3 fish. A pot plant drooped sadly on a pathetic wire pedestal in one corner. The room's harsh strip lighting brought every badly painted corner, every bit of dirt into sharp focus. The piss-poor attempts at making them feel at home were given the death blow by the poster on the wall which warned of the penalty for biting staff. Hadn't occurred to Sean that he would ever want to. Now he knew that if he did, he would get 28 days added to his sentence. Presumably someone had needed telling. A couple of uniformed guards, screws, Sean reminded himself, if he was going to fit in here, stood watch over them. White short-sleeved shirts with epaulets, black clip-on ties. One of them had a brown and white dog. Sean was pretty sure it was a spaniel, which had made a fuss of them as they all entered, running around with its tail wagging, sniffing, letting them give it a pat. It had even butted its nose against Sean's leg as he waited in his chair, looking up at him with hopeful brown eyes. He had given its head a fondle because it seemed like the right thing to do. One by one they'd been called over to the counter, and now it was Sean's turn. The woman gave the keyboard a final thump and nodded abruptly to where one of the screws waited by the side door. "Go with Prison Officer King for the body search." Oh, shit. Everyone from the van, one by one, had been going through that door. Sean had seen each one of them hesitate before a screw took them firmly by the arm and led them away, and now he knew why. If there was one joke at last night's party that Sean hadn't found funny, it was the one about the body search. Lads miming, snapping latex gloves onto probing hands. Well, if he was going to tough it out for the next year, this was where he started. He nodded and let King guide him. The screw walked with all the grace and threat of an overweight Rottweiler. He had muscles, but he also had a belly straining against his shirt. Not that Sean was considering having a go. What would be the point? Where would he go afterwards? Through the door, a screw with a face like an angry rat waited in a small bare room. His name tag read, Prison Officer Cage. There was a table with a screen and some kind of kit on it, but Sean's gaze went straight to the thing next to it. It looked a bit like the electric chair used in all the movies. "Remove everything except your underwear," Cage snapped. Sean realised he had just been standing and staring at the chair. "Today, if you can." Sean stripped down to his boxers and passed the pile of clothes to Cage, then stood in the middle of the room for King to make a visual check that he had no contraband taped to his skin. Next, the warder ran hard fingers through his hair, peered into his ears, and held his mouth open with a spatula. Finally, he patted down Sean's thighs, arse and balls through the fabric of his shorts. "Nothing of interest here," he said with a huge smile. Sean guessed it was an old joke. "And now we look where the sun don't shine." Sean swallowed. But he remembered how he had resolved to get through this. He hooked his thumbs into the elastic of his boxers and started to slide them down. "Don't be soft," Cage shot King a glare. "Mr. King likes to think he's a comedian." "Hey, it never gets old. The look on their faces." Sean felt his face flushing red and hid his confusion in as much anger as he dared show. "So what do I do then?" "You keep your knickers on and you sit down there." King gave Sean a gentle push towards the chair. "Just sit." "Just sit," Cage confirmed. "What does it do?" Sean asked. He carefully placed his arse on the hard plastic surface. It was even less comfortable than the seats in the van. At least those were roughly bum-shaped. This was just a hard, flat surface. "It scans you. This is the Body Orifice Security Scanner. BOSS for short. If the alarm goes off, we know you've got something inside you that you shouldn't have." "What? Drugs?" King shook his head. "We've already checked that," he said. "You saw the dog, right?" Sean remembered the dog. He thought it was just being friendly, so it was scoping him out for possession. Sneaky four-legged tosser. "Nah, we're talking way more exciting than drugs," said Cage. "We've had weapons, mobile phones. One guy managed a grenade. Had to call in bomb disposal to give him an enema. Mr. Cage has been in this job long enough to remember when the only way to find out for sure was to have a good old root around ourselves," said King. "Progress is an amazing thing." Christ, made my fingers sore. Cage pressed a number of buttons and looked at the screen. Sean heard a few whirs and buzzes, saw some flickering lights. "Boss says you're clean." That's it. Sean had been through so much bullshit since getting nicked that he couldn't quite believe anything could only take a couple of seconds. "Unless you'd like us to get the gloves and Vaseline out for old time's sake," King said. "This way. Bring your clothes." Next stop was a narrow room with another counter and a door at the far end. This counter had a grill from the top to the ceiling. They made Sean stand against a measuring stick stuck to the wall. "Tall," said the screw behind the counter. "Shoe size?" 11. The counter screw pushed a pair of packages wrapped in cellophane through a square gap in the grill, followed by a plastic box. "Your new outfit." King pushed the packages at Sean. One was clothing, the other was a pair of scuzzy trainers. King pointed at the box. "Everything else goes in there. Clothes, watch." He tapped the ring in Sean's left ear. "Jewellery, apart from approved religious items, if you're wearing it, take it off and it will be kept secure for you until your release." Sean stared at the box. On its side was a shiny new label showing his photograph and a number. His prison number. If any further confirmation was needed of where he was and what he was, that was it. He pulled open the cellophane. There were even prison-issue Y-fronts. How many other men's balls had been where his were going? He shuddered. The rest of the clothing was basically a tracksuit, though the colour had faded from what must once have been a vivid lime green to something more like mould. The material was stretched and worn. He pulled it on silently while the screws behind the grill catalogued his clothes. The new outfit was a size too large, and it hung from his lanky frame like a baggy tent. Sean had to pull the drawstring as tight as it would go to stop the trousers falling down. He felt like a total prat and had no doubt that he looked like one too. The box was taken back inside the grill, and with it went his last physical connection to his life outside the prison. He signed a receipt for everything he'd given up, and a last cellophane package was pushed through the grill. King handed it over. "Prison issue towel. Ready?" Sean held the pack under his arm and nodded. "This way." The warder felt for the keyring chained to his belt and turned to the far door. It opened into a dark, wet night where rain hammered down on a covered walkway. "Welcome to paradise."